just to explain to everybody, the idea of this session is to get Thomas's view on the theme of the seminar and his take as a social scientist on the world's situation at the moment. But probably as early as 20 minutes or so into this, we're going to open it up for questions and participation. So if anybody's got any questions and comments they'd like to type out, I'll ask Dominic in a while, and he'll start inserting a few for us to mull over and as we go along. So let's start off, just right at the beginning, Thomas, and just basically your general thoughts on the keynote that we have for this seminar.
Easy question. Actually, I just saw something, somebody named Ellie in the chat said wars are always about fighting over resources. And yes, I would say that's very true. Conflict in general is over resources, and so many wars are fought over material resources, but there are cultural, educational, political resources, networks, social networks. And how do we manage that spiritually? We talked yesterday, as you said, in preparation, and I've been thinking a lot about empathy in terms of conflict. We just had an election here in the United States, and I've seen on some social media how people are, the losing side is asking for understanding. And a lot of people on the winning side have said, you didn't give us that in 2016. And I would say, yes, that's true. It's not like anyone is necessarily owed empathy if they won't provide it. But if we want to get along, if we want to solve problems, if we want to manage and solve conflict, create harmony through a conflict, we need to be open to the other's point of view, to listen, to get out. My favorite phrase with my students is get out of our own heads. That is one thing that I try to teach my students. Get out of your own head, look at the world from another point of view. It's very difficult. It's especially difficult when people are wounded, and most people are wounded or traumatized in a minor way or a major way. And so to pay attention to someone else's needs, someone else's point of view, is very difficult. And I've been thinking about this. How do we acknowledge? We don't have to necessarily prioritize other people's needs, but we have to acknowledge them. And how do we scale up empathy? Empathy is quintessentially individual, one person at a time with another person. So many conflicts are group conflicts. Below the, as international relations scholars put it, below the level of the state, state being country, nation. And a lot of societies, countries are composed of multiple groups fighting for resources. And I don't know how to scale up. I'm thinking about that. How do you scale up empathy so to be group to group? Pay attention to their needs. Be aware of your own needs. Be aware. What was it? Somebody in the chat just said, I'm getting pop-ups, and so I'm glad. Conflict is usually due to erroneous beliefs. Hearing other points of view might break through your own erroneous beliefs. And I would say, in terms of the spiritual conflict that is spreading throughout the world right now, or material conflict, which is ultimately a spiritual conflict.
And of course, that
listening.
is of a different nature now. I mean,
It is.
whereas empathy, I think there's a lot of hope for developing empathy in the young in education at the moment, and there's quite a lot of focus on that when you look at the various movements that are taking place. I think internationally, we probably lost a big opportunity with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, because
Yes.
on diplomatic and political stage, that was the time when the liberal ideal and the liberal idealists should have seized that opportunity to practice empathy and to understand the other point of view. And now we're in a position where we're becoming worse than we were before the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
And new
Yeah.
forms of war now that are not so much geopolitical, but they are more identity politics and not just about resources, but they all have their basis perhaps in the economy. And yes, we missed an opportunity there, but it's how do we now recover from that, and where are the statespeople that we need to lead the way?
I don't know where they are.
Mm.
Maybe I'm training some of them in my classrooms, and other people are too. But yeah, we talked about this yesterday. We talked a lot about this yesterday. I will say that I'm a historical sociologist, which is not a historian, but not a present-oriented sociologist. I'm aware of the long term, and yes, the fall of the Berlin Wall and after that was, I agree. I'd never really thought about it. A lost opportunity, and it was power politics again. America was quite triumphalist, rather than, oh, this system collapsed, we could help them out. It was more, the system collapsed and we were right and you need to be like us. There was a lot of that, and now that's been sort of enshrined in development discourse and international relations discourse as the transition. They call it the transition, and transition economies, transition from socialism to capitalism. There's not a lot of empathy in capitalism. It doesn't really work that way. It's very competitive, and I'm not a socialist. I think that went too far in terms of collectivism and stomping on freedom. Capitalism goes the other way too far. I don't know about what we should do, but we're raised, certainly in the United States, probably in what we could call greater Anglo-America, Australia, Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Britain itself, to think very commercially and very competitively, not necessarily the case in the rest of the world. But the US is dominant, so we can impose our neoliberal agenda. That's breaking down. And so to get back to historical sociology and what you just said, there are these longer trends. East Asia is becoming much more wealthy, much wealthier, sorry, much more powerful. Power may shift on the planet that way. I've seen nobody think about long-term shifts. Europeans have been dominant the last few centuries on the planet. That was not always true in world history. Shifting to East Asia, or South Asia, East Asia, which was a dominant region in the world before 1500, that might just create much more conflict. Or it might be that the Europeans, if we think in the long term and in terms of what regions in the world can contribute to humanity, to develop humanity spiritually, maybe East Asia is now going to contribute its own thoughts, ways of being, ways of thinking to the rest of the world. And the way the Europeans contributed was mostly through conquest. And that's why I put it in quotes. It would be nice if the Chinese didn't do that. They have a long history of doing that, as we see with the Uyghurs in Western China and Tibet, much like the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians and the Europeans. So cautiously hopeful, as I said yesterday, that we're on this planet together. I'm seeing various comments in the chat about that. They're long and I can't read them all. I don't quite know where I'm going with this. All I'm saying is that there are these long trends, and
these long trends that you talk about isn't one of the problems now that there is no more time for long trends. These trends are going to become shorter trends.
maybe
just because of the amount of energy that's on the planet at the moment. We have a disruptive technology. We have social media growing all the time with truths and falsity and the blurring divisions between them.
Yes.
We've got rampant economics, where the rich are getting richer, as always.
Yes. Yes.
Poorer, and it's leading us to this form of hyper-globalization, which is far too much too soon. And it's producing this conflict where globalization can no longer be managed, if it ever was in the first place. It certainly can't be now. It's a runaway train. And because it can't be managed properly, it is producing populism. And the populism in its turn then is adding to the equation, whereby international cooperation is thwarted, and that in turn adds to what is essentially gridlock.
Yes. Let me collect my thoughts for a minute. That's a lot.
Basically, it's the economic drive. You know, there's too much focus on the economy rather than government statesmanship and the departments that should be running human affairs of politics having a greater role to play, whereas economics seems to be out of control.
But I think we get back to what Ellie said at the very beginning: wars are about resources. People are so used to, let's put it this way, the death rate, the mortality rate on this planet has always been, for all animals and therefore for humans, very high, 50% at age 20. That was very common around the world. Didn't matter what society you were in. That's fallen dramatically, meaning our lifespan has extended dramatically. But we have this hangover of thousands of years of worrying physically. We're still very materially oriented. Elites are very materially oriented. So we have this almost obsession with the economy, as you say. People are talking in the chat. I really would, in a few minutes, I'd like us to read through the chat silently for a second. But people are talking about sharing a lot. And yeah, I agree. But that's the big question. How do you get people who are so used to not sharing to start sharing? I mean, we have tremendous economic inequality in the United States, in greater Anglo-America. It's not so bad in Scandinavia. It's pretty terrible in Latin America. It's easing. Inequality is easing somewhat in some Asian countries. But it's still, even if inequality is easing in some places, globalization is, as you said, very disruptive on a personal level, subjecting people to a lot of conflict and looking for answers. There's populism. And on an international level, power shifts in the world. There are more and more billionaires, but they're concentrating not all of the wealth, but quite a bit of it. We have in the United States a couple of billionaires, Bill Gates and others, who turned philanthropy into philanthropists after they made their money. How can we set up a system where people are not so ready to make so much money and gather it all to themselves and share?
Well, that's right.
I don't know how to persuade them, and I agree, but how do you do? So many people, I see this here and I see this in other places. So many people say, we need to do this, we need to do that. And I always wonder, politically, how? How are you going to accomplish that? And
bringing in the idea, though, of World Goodwill
Okay.
And the amount of people now that are becoming more enlightened in their thinking, I don't see that there's going to be any dramatic answer like how do we do this or how do we do that. But force of circumstance is going to be one. For instance, the environment, as we all know, humanity has now got a common enemy. And a common enemy has the effect of uniting people to come together to face it. And then we have nuclear proliferation, we have race problems and that. And you see at the same time that people are coming together to voice goodwill and right relationships. And it is, after all, world goodwill takes place in the sphere of the mind and then the emotions, and then it manifests on the physical plane, potency, precipitation. So don't you see the sort of like the mass civil movements, the gatherings, the discussions, the formation of NGOs as all part of a long-term solution that's slowly filtering down and conditioning people's behavior?
I would like to think so. And now I would go back to what you said. Are we running out of time? Are the cycles?
That's crisis for you.
That's right. I mean, yeah, in the United States, I'm very encouraged when I read a lot of what young people say. They're more aware than my generation of how people are psychologically and what people need, and that is a good foundation. And I think in Europe that might be the case. One thing that's actually quite important and goes to what you just said is nearly everybody at a certain age on this planet is literate in some language. That's been a major accomplishment. Even though it's been done very technocratically by the World Bank, it's been done. So even in Africa, it's like 90% literate, ages 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And those people are going to grow up around the world, not just Africa, everywhere, literate, reading Chinese or reading one of the major European languages, reading Spanish. And I think that literacy will really fuel what you just said about movements, civil society. That is one real possibility that people are getting sick of in a really big way globally. People are sick of power politics as usual. They have enough. We have physically enough. Why can't it be distributed better? We don't have to steal from the rich. They could be encouraged. I don't know. Obviously, I'm conflicted. Do you mind if we go to the chat and read some of these for a minute? Because people are really contributing a lot of thought.
While you're having a look at that, one thing I'd like to raise from the point of world goodwill is you'll all be familiar with one of the probably most powerful phrases that we use in the Great Invocation. It's a prayer for all of humanity. And I've always been drawn by that last stanza, let light and love and power restore the plan on earth. And this whole idea of a divine plan, the word plan isn't perhaps the greatest, but there's no other word to use. You know, it sounds a bit like a blueprint or on some sort of technical drawing. But nevertheless, you know, the idea that there is some kind of destiny, somewhere where social evolution is leading us, and the role that light and love and power, and what those three terms actually mean, not just in their mystical connotations, but what does light actually mean? And what is love in the form of relationships? And for that matter, most of all, what is power? Because ultimately it's the wrong concentration of power that's creating the mess that the world's in at the moment. And it has to become the right concentration of power and used in dynamic relationships that we can, so that we can all move forward together as one. Have you picked up anything you'd like to?
I've picked up 3 or 4 different things. Somebody named Wilbert has asked me about leading out, and 2 or 3 women have said the power of women could be allowed, opened up, which there's been a tremendous imbalance over really the last 6 or 7 or 8,000 years. That's really when the original human groups, hunter-gatherers spreading throughout the planet from Africa, were, at least in social power, not physical power, but social power, gender equal. And that started to change thousands of years ago. And we have an opportunity to change back for women to have much more power, much more say in the world. And it's changing. In terms of one lifetime, it's way too slow. In terms of world history, it's changing very quickly. A few hundred years to reverse that would be very fast. And it would make a big difference. There's even political science research showing that when women are in political power, the entire society benefits. They pay more attention to more often, not always. There are plenty of women who are power hungry, but more often than men, they're less power hungry and they pay more attention to everyone's needs. So that is one answer that gives me hope.
As part of that equation, though, that's a wonderful thing that's happening, but is there also the redefinition and the realignment of men and women so that we're starting to balance the polarities within us? Because as we know from the transgender movements, the problem kids have with their sexuality, there has been so much strong identity with either male or female in the past that now it's becoming quite confused. And people are starting to discover within them both the male and the female, but they don't know how to balance it and how to express it, because ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever our form is, we can draw on both of these qualities.
You know, we can, and there are so many places in the world. You see it in the United States, and the phrase is toxic masculinity. One type of masculinity, there are many types, as you're implying. But there's so many places in the world where they believe very deeply in a complete separation, masculine and feminine. And your idea that we could each individually draw on both, that gets back to whoever said erroneous beliefs. I agree with you, but breaking through these really rigid ideas about men and women is very important.
Wouldn't you say this is happening, though?
It is.
A lot, in the public eye, these discussions are coming out about discovering the more feminine side and indeed talking about empowering women. Although we only see it in the short term, if we stand back and observe what's actually happening, there is some kind of balancing taking place, not fast enough for sure, and conflict all the way, which is again part of the dynamics of crisis that's causing this. But in the long run, it is playing out through people and educators who have good things to say about this.
I want to get back to what you said a minute ago about gender, and it was yes, it's taking different form in different countries. I mean, Iran is still executing people for homosexuality. Other countries are doing that. Uganda is very much against it. Yet the challenge, there are a couple of governments, I think Rwanda right now, partly because of the genocide, has more than 50% of its government officials as women. And like the French have this parité requirement of, I think, 40%. They're working toward 50% of government officials being female. It's happening all over the world. Yes, it's not just where you are in England and we in the United States. And yet you still see honor killings in, for instance, Pakistan and in other countries. So the conflict is playing out within families and between sexes and gender being how we think about sex. That was totally not part of my thinking. It was totally not part of our conversation yesterday. In preparation for this, whoever introduced sex and gender as an issue on the global stage is absolutely right. I know I'm beginning to repeat myself. But I don't know if, again, in time, it can influence power politics. I'm hopeful that it can.
It's all about the time equation, isn't it?
It is. It really is. And again, I'm writing this world history, and I'm very aware of trends. It's very easy to say we're running out of time.
We're running out of time for this world history, Thomas. You told me about.
I know. I've been writing it for 7 years. I'm hoping to get a final draft within a year, and then in another year.
Waiting to see what happens, so it gets the end of the story right.
I know. But it's, yes. The most apocalyptic worries are that we could collapse, global warming and nuclear war and other problems. Civilizations have collapsed before, and we just constructed a global civilization. It could collapse. That isn't necessarily what's going to happen. We may be having these cycles, and we're just in a moment in the cycle where things are supposed to be much more anarchic. At least one set of political scientists talks about a set of cycles of 110 years. Concentration of one power, and then deconcentration, and then concentration in another power and deconcentration. Maybe they're right. Maybe that's not accurate.
We would agree with that, though, wouldn't we, from an esoteric point of view? Except we'd hope that those cycles would be spiraling in nature. So each crisis we revisit was slightly higher on the turn of the spiral than the one before. But that's not necessarily proving to be the case. They are just intensifying at this point.
Yes. I know. We are at a crisis point, and spiritually oriented people need to speak up more.
Can I just throw into the equation what I mentioned to you yesterday, which we were discussing in the Arcane School a couple of months back, that the number of NGOs, of non-governmental organisations, many of which now are called social profit groups, which I think is a much more dynamic term, there are 10 million in the world. Now, if you think that there are 10 million of those sort of, well, they're organisms, basically, they're living cells within the family of humanity. 10 million is an awful lot of NGOs, each one dynamically involved in a cause for human betterment and for the planet. And these sort of things aren't often thought about enough, but for our hope, it's a big figure. And of course, all the people who support these NGOs as well. So within the mental sphere, within the compassionate sphere, within the sphere of empathy of which you were talking about, this is where it is being expressed. They're not on the news headlines. So behind the scenes, well, not behind the scenes really, but not in front of us all on our television sets, this is growing all the time.
It is. It was there. Well, as I said yesterday, we've tripled in population in 70 years, from 1950 to 2020. And that generally population density means much more political formalization, and the UN having more and more functions, more and more international organizations, more and more regional agreements, more and more conventions. Say Mercosur, which is kind of an EU for South America in formation. I mean, the EU started as a trade group in the 50s. And then, as you say, 10 million non-governmental organizations. That's huge, and that's very encouraging that so many of them are devoted to public good rather than getting for ourselves. I don't know where to go with that, but I did see one thing. Heidi Kunkler in the chat said, as long as weapons are business, as long there will be wars. You know, in the Alice Bailey readings, there's a line that says, solve the economic problem and wars will largely cease.
Mhm.
And I think that gets back to what you're talking about. If we could solve economic problems, and the economic problem is multifaceted. There's still people dying of starvation on this planet today. That number's been going down for decades, and that's very encouraging. It's beginning to go up because of the pandemic, and that's not encouraging, but it's still a long-term trend. But then there's inequality and relative inequality that, okay, I have enough, but so many others have so much more. That's another source of conflict. I don't know how to solve that. And there's a lot of what people are talking in the chat. I've got the chat up about billionaires with thinly veiled agendas. True, very true. But again, what you said, it's a long-term shift. Maybe their thinly veiled agendas can be guided to even something better. I don't know.
Well, that's the big question. You know, it is always comes down to those simple things of sharing, doesn't it? And as part of that sharing, you also have to
Yeah.
have a higher purpose and goal in life. And particularly in the secular West, we're starting to lose any sense of higher purpose. So the economy is where we fulfill our desires. And you know, with when we think through the whole idea of the great teachers that have periodically visited us, from the Buddha to the Christ, taking the Buddha, for instance, his Four Noble Truths, which is actually in Buddhism, it's discussed as the law of dependent origination. There's that famous equation, which is just so simple, but it says so much if you look at it. And it's when this is, that is. From the rising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. I mean, really, it is that simple. It's the desire nature. And if we don't modify our desires and transmute them into a higher form of creativity, then it's going to run rampant and the world simply can't sustain it. So
No,
it
we
has to
can't.
be, and maybe the environmental crisis has to get a lot worse before it can get better. So although I'm concerned, obviously, like everybody else, about the environment, my firm belief is that once human consciousness is sorted out, then everything else will adjust itself accordingly, even if we think we've gone too far. Look at Chernobyl. As soon as humanity moved out of the devastation of that area, it didn't take long before nature reasserted itself.
Yeah, actually, I think people don't trust nature enough to, as you say, reassert itself. If we could stop doing a lot of what we're doing and get out of the way, it would come back pretty quickly. Problem is we're not getting out of the way. And yes, one major area of cooperation should be the environment, not just global warming. There's species destruction, deforestation. I mean, the Brazilians are just going, sure, burn the forest, cut down the forest, no problem. Yeah, it's a problem. But, you know, you started off talking about education and education as the foundation. I agree. I don't think education is enough. But without education, we're lost. It's the first step. It's the foundation. And educating people about how human economic systems directly impact the environment so much is really important.
And do you think we're learning a lesson in this pandemic?
Yes.
People
Yes.
seem to think that we are, and others think that it's a temporary thing, that as soon as this pandemic is over, that we're going to go at full speed back into rampant materialism.
I don't think we will fully go back into rampant materialism, mostly. I think a good chunk of people will have learned a lesson. I am, sorry, cynical enough that I don't think enough people will have learned that lesson. But a lot of researchers are saying, well, this is just the first pandemic. We keep treating wild animals a certain way. We keep stumbling, blowing into their habitats. We're going to get more pandemics. Maybe we need the second one, unfortunately, and that means a lot more human death. But we're already causing a lot of animal death and plant death. Yeah, we may need more and more environmental crises. You talked about a common enemy or a common purpose, I would say. It may be that the environment says, sorry, we are the limit. If you don't like it, too bad. And humans have to listen. And we have to come together for, people in the chat are talking about a greater purpose. Yeah, we have to come together for a greater purpose. And I would like to see something as material as the environment not be the end of it for a greater purpose. We come together for a greater purpose and discover more than just our physical environment, relationships with each other. I think it's worth mentioning, and then I would like to read more in the chat. Economists of all people, academic economists, have been doing happiness studies. They want to know, does money buy happiness? And the very quick answer is yes, up to a point. Beyond that, not really. The more sophisticated answer is increasing the amount of money you have will always increase your happiness. But you get to a certain point, a lot of money gives you a little bit more happiness, and a lot more money gives you only a little bit more happiness. And they say, past economists of all people, sociologists have been wanting to hear this for years, and we finally are hearing it. Beyond a certain point, you're better off putting your energy and your time into relationships, human relationships, than money. And I think this is kind of what the Tibetan meant when you solve the economic problem, wars will largely cease. When people have enough materially, there are other things like caring about each other, meeting each other's needs, loving each other, being kind to each other, enjoying and doing fun things together, to put it very simplistically.
I think that's where it comes back to education, because that's where we can bring in the sense of fulfillment, because, and then we will go along a certain course in order to find fulfillment in creative ways. But if you come out of your education fairly empty in that department, then no matter how many people who've got money tell us, oh, it's not that great to have money, you're going to want to find out for yourself.
Yes.
And learn
yes, you will. Yes.
So we just can't afford that to happen. So it's that lesson somehow has to be learned without going through collectively that whole experience.
It does. And so many people, certainly in a commercial society like the United States, try to meet their needs by going way past that point where money, you should put your energy into other things. They keep going after the money, keep going after the money. They're not learning the lesson you just talked about. Can we pause and look at more in the chat?
Sure.
We seem to be stimulating a lot of people's thoughts, and I want to hear them or read them.
At this point, Lon, do you want to see if anyone wants to actually contribute an audio contribution?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So if anyone wants to make an audio contribution, you can, if you go into the participants, you can raise your hand. There's a little button that allows you to raise your hand, and then we can unmute you. Somebody's done one right away.
People want to speak. I don't blame them.
Yes. Okay. Janice, Dolly, do you want to unmute yourself, Janice?
Yes. Okay.
Give everyone a go. Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to say I'm finding this conversation disappointingly third dimensional. I think we have to raise our consciousness and understand what the mystics have said for centuries, And what leading edge science is now confirming, that the world is one interconnected whole. We are all interconnected. So we need to help shift the whole world view of everybody. And the other thing that comes with that is that love is the glue that holds everything together, and everything's part of it. You use the term the environment, but even the term the environment, which I grew up with, I'm a geographer in my background, that is actually not admitting that nature is part of everything too. So the divine, however we see that, the I am they're celebrated in all the traditions, is actually present in it all, and we are part of it. And I just would love to see the conversation raised a little from the old economic sociology, all that sort of debate. We've got to lift our sights higher, lift up your eyes. That was what we were told. So I think that's my contribution. And somebody in the chat, Teresa Keys, was saying too that we need to focus on our interconnectedness and cooperation, and realizing that because we are all one, which we are, our actions affect all, and values of compassion and right relations and taking responsibility for the whole would become the values we live by collectively. So maybe Teresa would like to add something, but I think that's the contribution I'd like to make. Thank you.
While we're waiting for that, I think it's very true that in what you say, to a point, although I don't think the mystical vision is for all of us, and I'm one of those people who doesn't respond to it. I think it lacks purpose and dynamism, and it's all very well to talk about us all being one. We did that in the 60s, and it didn't really get us anywhere in the end. It created a next step on the way, but there is a place for the mystical vision. But to say that we're all one and that we're all children of the one Father, that sort of thing, it's there are real problems that have to be dealt with at a pragmatic level and a practical level. And I think that the way that we can do that, particularly from World Goodwill's way of addressing things, is to show that energy, the thought actually is an energy that can be directed and can be specifically contributed to certain causes. And in that way, perhaps we can take some of the mystic view, but also combine it with the dynamism of a more energetic way of looking at things. I know you won't agree with me about that, perhaps, Janice, but I think that there is a divide there. When I look at the general public, I don't think they're going to respond to a mystical vision.
Well, I think I see her point. It kind of goes back to what I was saying about what economists have found about happiness, that once you make enough, other things are more important. And it may be that we have to lead humans to make enough, the old way of thinking about the economy, as Janice said, get that to a point where we can focus on interconnectedness, relationship. I don't know that, yes, mysticism is going to reach everybody. It won't. But talking about friendship, talking about, I mean, a simple word is fun with other people. Things are generally more fun together than they are alone. You can get a lot deeper than that. Mm-hmm. But I agree with her point about interconnectedness. And I would say that it's more, how do we lead people toward that? How do we get them off of the material world and so much attention on the material world?
Well, doesn't have to be.
I think meeting economic needs is a start. Once people have enough materially, they can pay attention to other things. So I don't know. What do you think, Lawrence?
Well, I'd like to ask Janice to come back to her and say, what is the vision that she has for humanity?
Okay.
Human destiny, what's the next stage of it? Is there anything beyond this feeling of interconnectedness? Is there a part of the divine plan that's leading us on to the next dynamic externalization of it? Is there something a little bit more than these terms of peace and interconnectedness, which to my mind seems something that is a prerequisite to take us on to the next stage of things?
Well,
I think there's a lot of spirituality and a tremendous amount of vision that's out there in the world, and it's being voiced by certain politicians, by economists, by all sorts of members of enlightened thinkers. And it's not necessarily in mystical terms, but it is in terms of oneness and cooperation and unity in ways that the general public will respond to.
can you still hear me?
Yes, let's hear what you would respond, Janice. Go
Well,
ahead.
we started by looking at education, and children are not born fighting each other by and large, unless you take my best teddy bear or something. They're curious, they want to learn, and if from that early age they learn, if their parents had a whole world view and really saw the big picture, they don't have to be mystical. It's just that the mystical aspects of all spiritualities and science are now saying the same thing. So there is now time that we can really bring in a different understanding of life right from the beginning. And then cooperation comes naturally from that, because we are all interconnected. And I think you can't solve problems at the 3D level. You've got to raise it to understanding at a higher level. It's again where education comes in at all levels. And then people naturally want to love each other and be together and have the fun and cooperation that Sir Thomas is talking about. It follows.
I mean, what you're talking about, Janice, for instance, in terms of science's approach, showing that we're all united and all one, that's absolutely true. But it does seem to me that it is because we're in that sphere, and we know the people who are saying that, the Rupert Sheldrake's of the world and Jude Caravan, etc. And we know that's true, but yet conventional science, conventional physicists are very strongly opposed to that still, and it's looked and deemed quantum mysticism. And there's still a big battle to tackle in scientific thought forms, which are almost as strong as the old religious ones, dogmas that have
Yes.
to be broken down. How?
Yes. Yes.
The
I mean,
of science just gets bigger and more complicated all the time. All things that don't fit together, they just attach another equation to try and solve the problem. If that collapses at some point, and some of these great thinkers are proved incontrovertibly correct, then that could certainly take us a quantum leap into the future of interconnectedness and our appreciation of it.
I was thinking, go ahead, Janice.
I can say that Dr. Robert Muller, who was Deputy Secretary General of the UN, he started something way back. I mean, he's passed now, but and set up a whole world core curriculum, which is based on the oneness of all life. And these things are there, but there is all the while focuses on economics, important though that is, but that's become the driver and the be-all. And actually economics, which is about managing the home, the eco, is done without understanding the ecology, the knowledge of the home. So we've got to turn things on their head, really, and start from a higher place. And then children will grow in that knowing and loving. There's a project, David, I've forgotten his surname now, comes out of, he's based in Jerusalem, but he's started a project called the Loving Classroom, and it's really going into many schools throughout several countries, South Africa's particularly one where he's done a lot of work. And children are becoming more loving. They start with circles of sharing their feelings in the morning and difficulties, and learn to just love each other. These changes can happen, and I think they're going to happen in a shorter time scale than we would be, academics would project them. So yeah, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, I was thinking as you were talking, Janice, I agree with what you're talking about as a goal, and the question is, how do you accomplish it? Because as Lawrence said, there are plenty of people in academia. I'm in academia on campus, and just as an aside, Illinois State University. There are two different types, Lawrence. There's the University of Illinois. I'm not there. I'm at Illinois State University. But I'm on a college campus, and so many are very materialistic, and to introduce mysticism means they will ignore you, and you will not get a public platform. One would have to tone it down and learn to speak their language. Again, this is back to empathy. Learn to speak their language, meet them where they are, lead them toward something else. How do you get children who are born the way they're born as you say, Janice, to be raised a certain way when their parents are suffering from erroneous beliefs, illusions and glamours and traumas, and how do you break through that on an individual level, but also on a group level when so many groups are reinforcing each other's erroneous beliefs? There's a huge amount of resistance to what you're talking about. How do you accomplish it? And that's what I think Lawrence and I are trying to grope toward in terms of how do you accomplish it? I agree with you, Janice. So what do you think?
We all agree that the answer lies in education, as you talked about that, Janice. And I think, for instance, what we talked about, the big 3-year campaign of UNESCO's Learning to Become, and a redefinition of what education should be about, is a massive movement. It's just that not so many people know about it, but it involves politicians, mayors, youth leaders, and it's certainly well worth going to have a look at, because it's a good 3-year campaign, and it's creating a lot of ferment and the realization that, as you've said yourself, we have to get away from this the OECD governing economics and education at the same time. We have to get back to understand education as about bringing something, drawing something out of us. Part of that is the arts and the humanities. They've got to start taking more of a fundamental position in education and not being an add-on, which you just do to develop pro-social skills.
I'm sorry to interrupt at this point, but we're getting it rather short of time, Lawrence. Only another 7 minutes.
Okay.
So I don't know whether you want to try to round things off a little.
Well, I'll leave that up to Thomas.
People, we could go on for another 2 hours. So many people are saying so many interesting and helpful things in the chat that we're not going to be able to address, and I'm very sorry for that. But yeah, we have 7 minutes, and now we have 6 minutes. I don't know. I would say yes. Well, I'm just stuck with the question. Yes, we tend to agree on what needs to be done. How do we accomplish it? When there are so many people ready to fight it, ready to say, no, I want my things, I want my stuff, I want my money, I want power.
From the perspective of everybody watching this, Thomas, surely the answer is the mobilization of goodwill.
Okay.
As an energy.
Again, how? What does that look like concretely?
Well, doesn't it start with everybody who is now starting to practice not just meditation, mindfulness, creative thinking? There is a move now, whereas you'd be laughed at the classroom if you meditated 20, 30 years ago. Now it's part of some curriculums, and mindfulness and understanding the techniques of meditation. The fact that the Dalai Lama and Buddhism are something that people look up to and are interested to explore, including the physicists seeing the energetic dimension of Buddhism and meditation. These are all things that are growing throughout pop culture.
They are.
And when something grows in pop culture, you only take one icon to have something that goes viral and get several million views, and all of a sudden something becomes fashionable. And something as superficial as that can be actually quite a big step on the way.
Actually, I'm teaching pop culture again, and I completely agree. I haven't taught it in 13 years. I'm teaching it this semester. And
Grateful Dead albums out, are you?
No, it's way more than that. You're right that I mean, we're on right now celebrity, and yes, when celebrities talk about their personal struggles, that touches millions of people. And yes, what you just said, that you're almost shifting the agenda in public to think about traumas and needs, and that might be part of the opening, that this fluffy celebrity culture we have might in the long run do some good in terms of other forms of education, getting the word out, you know, what you've suffered, well, here's the celebrity who's suffered it, and you're not alone. It really is changing younger people in terms of how they, again, think about psychology. I think you're right. Popular culture, the educational system, having the UN behind something, rethinking education, will create resistance, but it will also really change how people think about education. A lot of people will be very open to it. It's very encouraging.
One of the things that we did touch upon yesterday, but just to round things up, because this leads into the next period of work, is and where we can do something substantial ourselves and play a part, if we believe in the power of thought and meditation. It's quite a little known fact just how fast international parliamentary institutes are growing throughout the world. And there's I think there's something over about 120, 30 of these institutes, and that's the encouraging sign of today, as well as the NGOs, is that parliaments, which means to talk and to discuss, to parley, there are these bodies that are discussing all these problems and being a higher moral compass for the direction of humanity. And I think that when we look towards all these positive developments, as Chris is going to expand on in a little bit, therein lies great hope. And rather than having fear about the current world situation, which is very understandable, we have to not add to that thought form through energy following thought, but we have to find out the good things that are happening, which is what we do in Goodwill, and then energize it. And that's the way that we can be of most assistance to bringing about what we all hope for.
No, the U.S., the United States, is not part of the Interparliamentary Union, and I think that's one reason I've been studying global issues for 30 years and I didn't know it existed. I had to look it up, and then I found, the U.S. helped form it in the 1880s and then bailed in the 1990s. And
I mean, it's responsible for forming the United Nations.
I know. And now the big chunk of the U.S. is the U.S. population is the UN. Oh my God! No, all these parliaments and all these NGOs are very encouraging. So many of them are based on some sort of goodwill, wanting to help, wanting to get beyond themselves and not just take, but to give. That's civil society, outside of the government, but collectively organizing to do good. And I agree with you. And I think it is 9:10. Perhaps we could end on that encouraging note.
Yes, I think so. What a conversation that's been.
Yes.
Very, very interesting, and particularly the participation of all the participants out there.
Yes,
we must do more of this thing, because it does, by having these sort of discussions and open questions and that, it is the very thing we're talking about, a new way of channeling creative energy in the creativity moment of spontaneity, thinking through left of field ideas. So I think along with the parliaments, the international parliaments of the world, we're developing our own, to talk and discuss and to build thought forms.
I will say, if I could say, people are thanking us in the chat, and I want, even though it was very frustrating not to be able to address everything people said in the chat. I want to thank every one of you for typing up your thoughts. There are 231 participants, and that's 229 people beyond you and me, who are reading each other's thoughts in response to what we're saying. I'm very grateful you all put it in the chat, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. And those who are thanking us, you're welcome.
Thanks very much, Thomas, and we'll speak again, I'm sure, because
yes.
I think we've started something.